It's 3 according to my clock, so I think we could start. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are presenting you another our similar events, which will be presented by Dr. Zama Meshadakan. He will present these topics about Kazakh diaspora repatriates in Kazakhstan and their how they are affecting to demographic status in Kazakhstan as well. So the topic will be interested from 2 sides. First, the repatriates' lives in Kazakhstan and their evaluation and their demographic trends. So I think it will be interesting for our participants. Without ado delay, the floor is yours. You can start.
Thank you very much. Me share my screen. Can you see my presentation? Okay, so thank you everybody for joining to this presentation. Today I'm going to talk about the Kazakh diaspora, a little bit from theoretical background of the idea of diaspora and how it's enrolled in the political actions of country and state building. We're going to talk about repatriation of ethnic Kazakhs and briefly, of course, the impact this repatriation process impacted the current outlook of ethnic, demographic, social, political, and cultural life of Kazakhstan of the current time. Before I start, I want to tell you that the presentation would, of course, touch some general and some overlook of the topic, because the topic is broad, has lots of statistics and lots of periods and lots of legal aspects and documents. I try to minimize all of them, so I'd rather talk more about the ideas and the concepts rather than certain specific data. Of course, there would be some data, some statistics, but I try to minimize them as much as possible, so we would not be dealing with them. But of course, in order to present any transformation, we need to show the numbers, so the numbers would be there as well. So when we think about diaspora, of course, when we think about diaspora, we talk about usually ethnic identities, often religious, sometimes ethno-religious or ethnocultural, depending on the identification. And of course, we talk about minorities, majorities from the same perspective, both when we talk about ethnicity and when we talk about religion. So even today, when we look at the region, when we look globally, we often come across idea of diaspora, which is very often connected with migrations, often connected with ethnic clashes, and also domestic and international political developments. If we take the region a little broader, we could talk about Afghanistan, and now we, at a time when different Central Asian states try to deal or handle the situation with their minorities, with their diaspora, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. So they have different approaches to what to do, for example, to ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, and Tajiks in Afghanistan. When we look at recent and ongoing conflicts in the region, whether we talk about Ukraine, Crimea, whether we talk about Georgia, Karabakh, and so on, we also come across the idea of diasporas, ethnic minorities, outside the homeland. So this is why the topic becomes important, was important all the time, and especially for the newly formed, newly established states, when we think about, for example, former Soviet Union and independent states, the issue of diaspora became a very, very big matter. We'll talk about how countries handle it, and we'll basically go on with our presentation. So when we talk about diaspora, there are some broad and narrow definitions of diaspora, but the important thing about diaspora is that diaspora is basically a group. It's a people of common origin. So whenever we talk about any diaspora, we basically have this idea of the common origin, which is there should be some identification. As I said, could be religious, ethnic, ethno-religious, and so on. They should reside more or less permanently outside the borders of the homeland. So if you're visiting another country, if you're there for a short stay, if you study there, if you have short business, and so on, usually you're not considered diaspora, because the permanence is important. You could be legally there, you could be sometimes on a temporary basis, but your residence there should be more or less permanent. So Kazakh tourists abroad are not considered diaspora, of course, because they don't reside on a permanent basis. And the important thing is that this group of people should identify themselves as part of the homeland of the national community. So if you are having a community which have no connection, either sides rejecting them, not accepting them, or they identify themselves differently, you technically stop being diaspora. So if we talk about Kazakh diaspora, of course, we talk about people of ethnic Kazakh origin. Of course, they should live outside the borders of the Republic of Kazakhstan, and they should identify themselves as Kazakhs, and they should be accepted by people here and also by the people of the host countries as diaspora. So if we talk about forming of diaspora, there's basically two ways how diasporas form. Right? One is the change of borders, and the other one is migration. It could also be the combination of both of them. So borders change and people move. Right? So whenever we talk about any diaspora, we should deal with an idea that either borders change, so some people left outside their traditional area of residence, or certain people moved across borders, and this is how they formed them. In doing so, we of course distinguish about what is known as autochthonous diaspora, and these are the group of people who lived there, just the borders changed, while the another group is people who were not living in that on the territory historically. So these are the people who moved there. So again, when we talk about Kazakh diaspora, historically, we know that there are certain areas that Kazakh traditionally lived just during the Soviet times, at the border change, certain regions moved from one place to another, and they found themselves in a foreign country as part of diaspora, although they were historically living on their own territory. And of course, we have people who moved historically later periods, early periods, and they also formed there. And another thing is that sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish who is living there on historical land and not. And this is also one of the major aspects and reason of ethnic conflicts. And whenever we talk about historical, for example, homeland formation, myth, claims, and so on, these issues come across. Right? When we talk about diaspora, we have the homeland. This is the country, community with which diaspora associate themselves, consider themselves as being part. And we have the host country, the foreign state, which is the state, the country which hosts the diaspora. So whenever we talk about diaspora, we always have a transnational, international, trans-state aspect, because otherwise we would not be talking about diaspora, right? So you cannot be diaspora within your own country. So diaspora becomes a matter of international politics automatically, because somebody lives in a different country, which another country, the kin state, claims to be part of, and this community also have certain types of loyalties to that. So that's why it's obviously an important and big international aspect. Right? When we talk about identities, how they identify themselves, usually we talk about ethnicity, and when we talk about diasporas, the most common diaspora identification is ethnicity, ethnic diaspora. Right? So very often when we talk about diasporas, we talk about ethnic diasporas in the first place. Very often, otherwise, we should distinguish linguistic, religious, and so on. Usually, not the most common part of that, right? Once again, this Eric Hobsbawm's definition of ethnicity. We would basically talk about group identity. There is the we factor, and there is the them, right? The others. So we are different from others, and we belong to that group, and that our group historically happens to be in some different place, and that's the important aspect. Right? And of course, diaspora politics often come across the idea of nationalism, right? And state formation, of which nationalism is an important part, the idea of the forming state. And it's also the idea, as Ernest Gellner would say, is about the congruence of political and ethnic boundaries. So, as he would say in a very brief form, is that nationalism is an idea that people who ethnically identify themselves as one group should more or less live within the political borders of the state. This is the idea. This idea, for example, political and ethnic borders should match, brings in the idea of ethnicity, of course, because as we said, there are two ways of forming the diasporas. One is the border change, another one is migration. So if you want to have political and ethnic borders, ideally, theoretically, matching, congruent, then either borders should change according to your ethnic boundaries, or the people should move. So you should go to the country with which you identify. So that's why whenever we talk about diaspora, we always talk about migrations. And as I said, in addition to conflict, in addition to, for example, historical and other claims. Talking about ethnic identity and national identity, of course, depending on where you are, certain regions have a different idea what is nationality, what is ethnicity, what is nation. But the overall idea is that the national identity is usually associated with the state, so devotion to the state, while ethnic identity is more individual, devotion to a certain group with historical and ethnic and cultural, linguistic, religious bonds. We also know that ethnic identity and national identity also might not match. And for example, we could also talk about citizenship and nationality, right? Depending on where you are, depending on which approach you follow. For some people, citizenship, nationality should and would mean the same thing, while for some people that would be a different approach. So talking about diasporas and formation, as I mentioned, for example, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the newly independent states is the major, for example, the aspect which create the massive diaspora groups, because before that, being in one country, the mobility was different. So internal mobility within the Soviet Union, due to many reasons. Some were forced, some were deportations, some were for economic, political, career, and other reasons. But suddenly, in a matter of time, when state borders change, when empires, big states, federations collapse or split, there are lots of people who suddenly in one day they could find themselves in a different country. So that's why, especially for the former Soviet Union, diaspora politics become very important, because we have millions and millions of people who were part of the same country and suddenly ended up outside the country they ethnically, historically affiliate with. So this is the important aspect of that. For example, collapse of the socialist bloc created 33 new states, and we talk about starting from Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and so on. The collapse of the Soviet Union created 15 new states, right? And as I mentioned, usually there are lots of internal migration within the country, and they have different status, like that was within Yugoslavia, within the Soviet Union. But suddenly when the borders change and countries become independent, then that migration automatically becomes international migration and brings in different aspects, brings in security concerns, legal concerns, and so on. So the collapse of the early years of the collapse of the former Soviet Union is believed to bring in around 5 to 10 million international migrants. So these are the people who moved from one former Soviet republic to another. Right? And this is one of the major groups. When we look at, for example, international migration of that period in early 90s and later on, we would see a huge jump, and most of them were actually provided by international migration within the Soviet Union. Otherwise, people don't move from their homelands very often. For example, the World Work Statistics would say, and UN statistics say also, less than 3% of people in the world leave the country of origin. And we talk about 258 million people, which is globally not a significant amount. So usually people don't move, but suddenly in certain regions, we have a very extensive movement. Right? And when we think about, for example, changing of borders, for example, collapse of empires, the idea is that a movement wouldn't stop there when people move on, and then for certain reasons, political, economic, and so on, they feel so often much more comfortable moving within the former borders. So just one of the ideas, for example, reflections of that is that, for example, we could talk about in Russian Federation, we have now around 5 million migrants born in Central Asia, and these are the people who are registered, officially residing there. So 5 million people moved from Central Asia to Russia alone. And of course, here we would talk about different type of migration, ethnic migration, we could talk about career migration, labor migration, and so on. So the major aspect related to diaspora is conflict. And as we would see, and when we look at most conflicts today, doesn't matter where, we very often come across ethnic conflicts, and ethnic or religious conflicts are the major type of conflicts. They happen at local basis, civil wars or local clashes. They also sometimes transcend the borders of state, becoming an international conflict. So diaspora, ethnic conflict become a very, very vivid type of conflict. Now, in modern time, usually states don't fight with each other, independent states, and we often talk about non-state or civil war and ethnic and religious clashes. So whenever we talk about Afghanistan, Syria, and so on, right? Whenever we talk about Ukraine, whenever we talk about any other place, that's the common type of conflict. And that's why study of diaspora and the diaspora politics become an important aspect of conflict, avoiding conflict, sometimes the cause of conflict. According to the security studies idea, the major theories related to conflict claim that when the national populations are compact and homogeneous, this situation reduces conflicts. And when ethnicities, nationalities dispersed abroad and intermingled with others at home, so mixed with other nationalities, ethnicities locally, while you have your fellow ethnic groups around you, is often a situation which intensifies this conflict. And that's what you could see in many places, whether you take Yugoslavia, whether you take many clashes in Africa, Latin America, anyway, right? So this is the major idea. So diaspora becomes directly a matter of national securities and also becomes an instrument for suppressing, or for example, instrument for as leverage in international politics. And that's why diaspora is directly related to that. When we look at the ethnic Kazakh repatriations, right, a little bit jumping forward from the perspective of conflict, as we said, if in order to avoid conflict, ethnic conflicts and other conflicts, you should try to be more ethnically homogeneous or nationally homogeneous at home, and you should also have less compatriots around you. And ethnic Kazakh repatriation from that perspective also served an important conflict reducing role, since we talk about, again, homogenization of the core population. So due to ethnic Kazakh repatriation, the ethnic Kazakh population in Kazakhstan increased substantially. And also, since they usually come from neighboring countries, that also is believed to reduce certain ethnic potential, for example, ethnic clashes or confrontations in the neighboring countries. And if we would look back at early 90s, if we would look at regional and also global news about Kazakhstan due to a specific ethnic composition, many people had very gloomy scenarios, pessimistic scenarios about the civil war, separatism, and so on for Kazakhstan. And that was one of the major claims in early 90s by many studies or experts. But we could see now, looking back, that luckily did not become an issue, and I think Kazakh repatriation also believed to be playing an important role. It's not only ethnic Kazakh repatriation, we also could talk about millions of non-Kazakh ethnicities moving to their historical homelands. And as we said, the collapse of empire, many people found themselves in different places. And that is also an important aspect of reducing conflict. So people would go to the country they historically identify with. When we said about Russia, 5 million people from Central Asia, born in Central Asia, of course, we should also, there's a big amount of them who were born in Kazakhstan, and most of them, for example, ethnic Russians who repatriated to their historical homeland, to Russia. In 1923, for example, the idea of reduced conflict became after the War of Independence between Greece and newly formed Turkish Republic. They decided, this time forcefully, to exchange population. So ethnic Greek population was sent to Greece, and ethnic Turkish population from Greece was sent to Turkey. And of course, this is one of the let's say, unimaginable today, probably, but also a very revolutionary move at that time. But the idea behind that was the same, that if it would be, we would be much stable and safer if we would have less diaspora groups, minorities within that country. And these became the two countries which happened quite extensive through historical reasons, fellow compatriots in both countries. And for example, we talk about Greece, which received almost 1 million people, which for a small country is a huge number. Looking at diaspora and politics, and when we look at the types of state formations, right, and identities behind the state, we have what is called the inclusive vision of state. This is it's more or less associated with the civic identity. Civic national idea is basically citizenship, and nationality would mean the same thing. And while there is also the exclusive vision of state, this is the one is based on ethnocultural coordination. So somehow, if you, for example, are coming from an ethnic background of a certain country, if you have this exclusive vision of state, very often you can claim, you can move there, they would accept you, they would give you citizenship, repatriate you to some extent, while in some types of state and politics, this is not the case. And of course, depending, there are lots of ideas about how to get citizenship, and this is when the inclusive and exclusive versions of state come across. There is no ideally or purely inclusive vision of state. There is no exclusive, purely version of the state identification. Very often countries are somewhere in between, but they could be inclined toward one of them. Right? And from that perspective, when we look at, for example, Kazakh repatriation, we could also would say that through the process that, for example, Kazakhstan at times was close to the idea of the coronation. So certain people, ethnic Kazakhs born and maybe lived for a few generations outside the borders of Kazakhstan, could easily claim to become part of the state, repatriation, citizenship, and that's the idea. When we look at diaspora and the idea of, for example, national identities, there is what is called diaspora accepting, diaspora annexing, and this has also become an important aspect. Diaspora accepting are usually those who accept, these are those who for repatriation, they would say that, okay, I'm the state of Israel. If you are a fellow coming from our identity, fellow Jew, fellow Israelite, please come. You would always accept us. While there are certain diaspora annexing is often the idea that this is our historical land, we should take that region with them. And this becomes, of course, as we mentioned, usually one of the background of many clashes. So when we look at states, we usually have one group of states which says fellow brethren, fellow ethnic group, stay where you are, while there is the other one, diaspora accepting, is the one who says the fellow, for example, Kazakhs, come. Right? And obviously Kazakhstan is the diaspora accepting one. Looking at Central Asia, when we look at Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan is another Central Asian state with extensive diaspora in the region. Right? Slightly less in Kazakhstan, but when we look at other countries, like, for example, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, we could talk about millions of ethnic Uzbeks there. But due to historical reasons, political reasons, the attitude of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan towards diaspora was different. And Uzbekistan never had this massive inflow or repatriation attempts. At times, there would even, for example, during the Osh events and so on, they seemed to have a different approach. While Kazakhstan was the one, of course, for historical and demographic reasons, would be the one who would be interested in accepting diasporas. And depending on that, you often don't make any historical traditional claims to other land. If you would say, for example, that land is historically ours, then there would be no repatriation. Diaspora would not come back, right? And for that, you need to create an idea of that homeland is here. For example, fellow Kazakhs, this is your homeland, right? Wherever you are, it's not your homeland, is an important aspect of that. Again, Afghanistan, we have, for example, ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Kazakhs being evacuated. So, well, despite the fact that we're not accepting refugees. Ethnic Kazakhs from Afghanistan were brought in. They will be also evacuated, bring in. So this is, for example, what also Kyrgyzstan is doing with ethnic Kyrgyz in Afghanistan, while, for example, for Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the two other states with massive diaspora groups there, of course, there is no policy like that. So this is the idea. Right? So the cultural unity and, for example, the idea of fraternity is an important aspect. We briefly mentioned that, and for the former Soviet Union, this is usually ethnicity. So throughout Soviet period, there was a division of administrative units, republics based on ethnicity, and and also in the passports and the identification and statistics, people would go by ethnicity, and also there would be, for example, mass implications, policies targeting ethnicities, for example, deportations, Azga Turks, Messetian Turks deportations, or Crimean Tatar deportations, and so on. There were policies for following ethnic identification, so this is one of the strongest markers. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, there was no need to create an additional cohesive identity. That was the ethnic idea. Right? Of course, as Anthony Smith would also highlight, this important aspect is the recognized compact territory, the idea of homeland. And of course, the idea of homeland is a little diverse depending on which group you'll be concerned. So, for example, when we look at, for example, clashes in Eastern Ukraine and so on, the idea of homeland, whose land is this, why, is a big and important aspect there. This is also, for example, directly concerns diaspora, because as I mentioned earlier, if you would believe that you're staying in your historical homeland, which happens to be outside the borders of your national state, this is one attitude. If you create an idea that that's not your homeland, you were driven out of from here, for example, Kazakhstan, you did not historically live there, but this was your land, and you were driven by, for example, the Bolshevik regime, civil war, and so on. The identification, loyalty, and of course, repatriation becomes a different aspect from that. And there is Rogers Brubaker, another important thinker, an expert and author on identities and national identities, among other things, would also bring an idea of ownership. And this is very intact with the idea, what we call the titular nationality, that certain people, for example, certain ethnic groups would have this sense that this is my country, for example. Right? So, and it's very important to create an idea. This would, for example, inflict state building, nation building, and of course, repatriation. If, for example, an ethnic Kazakh somewhere would think that Kazakhstan is my historical homeland, this is my land, right? And I am, as an ethnic Kazakh, belong there, and I have the right to be there, right? And feel the idea of fraternity, for example. So it becomes very much important. So successful nation building processes would always struggle with, would always deal with that. And this is when it becomes important. When we look back again to the Soviet Union, we have ethnicity as the base of, for most cases, of administrative divisions and units. So we have Uzbekistan, we have Kazakhstan, we have Karakalpakstan, and they always have an ethnic, or for example, Ukraine and so on. They always have an ethnic identification. That's what brings in the idea of titular nation. So if I'm Kazakh and my state is called Kazakhstan, so that should be my land, is an important idea. Right? The idea of the ownership in homeland is different. So depending on different diasporas, have an approach that, okay, people say that this is historical for example, somewhere in Fergana, they would say that this is historically my land, just because of the administrative divisions and so on. It fell to another state, but otherwise this is my land. It's a different type of homeland as well. What is happening in Ukraine with Russia, that's another aspect as well, related to homeland, related to territory, related to the titular nation. This is an important aspect of that. Now, let's move to Kazakhstan. And I don't want to go too much into detail and too much into processes, but to receive an idea. And 1989 is the last all-Soviet census. The interesting thing with this census is that most of the outcomes were published after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Although census started in the Soviet Union, some of them were later published after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they went into this Statistics Committee of the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States. So this was basically the last broad all-Soviet reliable data on demographics, and for another 10 years, most of the newly formed state would not have a census of their own. So according to this last Soviet census, we could say that Kazakhstan, back then, Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, was a truly bi-ethnic republic with the share of ethnic Kazakhs and ethnic Russians being almost identical. So we talk about a very, very small difference between them. In modern times, if you would have a state like this, they would automatically be classified as bi-ethnic state. So this was the situation, right? And we could say that this is a quite grave situation, which brought in all these speculations about the separatism, collapse, territorial claims, and so on. On top of that, we also have, from ethnic perspective, a diverse and uneven territorial distribution. So this is, for example, the two provinces of Kazakh SSR back then, and the Kazakh-Russian ratio. And of course, this is the most ethnically Kazakh region and the most ethnically Russian province in 1989. And basically, the average ratio is the 2.5 to 1. So in Chimkent Oblast back then, how it was called, there were 3.5 Kazakhs to 1 ethnic Russians, while in northern Kazakhstan Oblast, that was exactly the reverse. So this is often considered one of the major issues and situations, and from looking back as the conflict and safety, we would come that this is not a very good situation from the perspective of avoiding ethnic conflict, and that is the major background of the consistent and the policy of Kazakhstan towards demographic and ethnic transformation. As an example, for example, by the same period, the Uzbek SSR, the ethnic Uzbeks made up 71% of Uzbekistan of the time, Uzbek SSR. And when we look at again, when we said that the Uzbek diaspora and Kazakh diaspora and the approach of the state towards them is different for different reasons, this is also one of the reasons. For Uzbekistan, there was no need to repatriate them. And so no need to create an idea of homeland return, while based on this statistical disparity, or parity actually, right? But from the perspective of ethnic Kazakh or Kazakh national idea, this is not a good situation. So the idea of creating idea of homeland, idea of creating the justification for return became a reflection of this situation. Obviously, the North Kazakhstan, which were more ethnic Russian, bordering Russia, so that's even, for example, from the perspective of security, that's an unlikely situation, a situation which would have grave consequences. So that is what we would be having. Jumping forward, avoiding repatriation as well, this especially territorial distribution became a matter of extensive domestic migration policy, because the compact ethnic residence of one group neighboring to the fellow kin state, this is not an ideal situation. And we also know that Kazakhstan carried out extensive domestic migration, administrative changes, so different provinces, oblasts, and so on were reshaped and redistributed. And there was also the migration from the south to north, the policy we have even now. Also would involve repatriations, because many repatriants were sent to north for very practical reasons. First is that lots of people from the left, ethnic Germans, ethnic Russians, for example, and there was abundance of house residences and the lack of people. But on the other hand, this would also become, especially when we look at quotas, when they could send you, the government could settle you or repatriate, for example, this also became a consideration. So domestically and internationally, the national policy of Kazakhstan was basically shaped by this fact, these statistics. But this is the ethnic composition of the Kazakh SSR, and by the same 1989 statistics. Right? Especially for those who are not familiar with Kazakhstan, people get very much surprised that, for example, we had almost 1 million ethnic Germans at the time. So Germans were the third ethnic groups. We also had a very extensive group of ethnic Ukrainians. The picture, of course, after 30 years of independence and the policies of different countries, repatriations, out-migrations, in-migrations, and the natural birth rate, the statistics changed extensively. But this is the situation which we would be facing back then. But again, Germans were also part of big repatriation policy by Germany, especially after unification. So the most of them, we talk about 75–80% of ethnic Germans, they left for Germany or some other regions close to Germany. So looking at the demographic transportation, as we said, we have the situation, and that situation should be dealt and handled. And when we look at, for example, population change, or what we would call demographic transformation, there are three ways population changes. Any population change comes through three aspects. These are the birth, death, or migration. And basically, there's no other way. Right? So when we look at, for example, how the ethnic composition, demographic composition of Kazakhstan is changed, we should look at birth and death and migration. Right? Death is, we would say, is a very certain thing. Right? So also relatively stable thing, death. But for example, migration is the one which could have very, very fast impact. You can change the population compound by migration, but for example, birth, especially births, are very difficult to predict and change in shorter period of time. Death obviously is an unlikely, it's a tragic way of changing societies. If we talk about, I don't know, wars and clashes and epidemics and so on. And so when we look at at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and independence of Kazakhstan, there were two factors which Kazakhstan could use to improve the demographic and also ethnic situation. And one is the higher birth rate, especially when compared to Russians, or what we call back then would be called the European ethnicities or Slavic ethnicities. It's not the case only for Kazakhstan. For the whole Central Asia, the average birth rate for Central Asian ethnicities were always higher than that of, for example, ethnic Russians. So one of the major points which change demographic situation is the higher birth rate. And starting from early 50s, for example, starting from 59 census in the Soviet Union, after the World War II and civil war and famine and repressions, when the ethnic Kazakh population dropped even further, one of the recovering aspects was the higher birth rate, which continues up to now. And we could see now at statistics, for example, 90%, depending on statistics, from 80 to 90% of the newborn babies in the countries now, ethnic Kazakhs, for example. We could also would say that the newcomers to school, the first grade of schools, which is basically a reflection of the ethnic composition and birth rate, we could see higher birth rate, which becomes an important boost for ethnic transformation. And another one is the Kazakh diaspora, right? It's repatriations. And this is also, we could be taking into consideration as an important and vital aspect. One aspect combining these two, it was believed that the Kazakh diaspora abroad also had a very high birth rate, even compared to the local Kazakhs. And when we, for example, take statistics about people who repatriated here, somebody comes here with families, with a group of people, become citizen of this country, and very often their children are not obviously in the statistics of repatriates. They're people born in Kazakhstan to Kazakh citizens, but this is the secondary impact. So diaspora groups usually having higher birth rate and on average number of children per household, they contributed to the population recovery here as well, which is difficult to catch in statistics. So they're not in the statistics. They're not people who born somewhere and came. So the secondary impact on recovery through diaspora compares even beyond just migrating to the country. This is the background of the Kazakh diaspora at the time of independence and slightly further. Statistics differ depending on the source. So very often it was believed that 4.5 million ethnic Kazakhs lived outside Kazakhstan at the time of the independence, which is more than 35% of overall Kazakhs. So more than 1/3 of ethnic Kazakhs lived outside Kazakhstan. This is one of the major diaspora groups globally. There are very few nations which would say that the extensive number of our fellow brethren live outside the country. There is also, especially, for example, considering statistics in China, there was always the questions about statistics. There was the belief that in reality they would be more, and there are specific ways of counting and so on. So some believe that the numbers could be bigger. So these are the major diaspora groups in ethnic Kazakhs, and for example, Uzbekistan and China being the two biggest countries hosting ethnic Kazakh diaspora. When we look at repatriation, we could also say that these two became the major source of ethnic Kazakh repatriates as well. Right? So Afghanistan, 30,000 then, now they're much, much less. We had several waves of ethnic Kazakh repatriation from Afghanistan, and this is the background. So when we look at diaspora, we're not talking about the few million people, 100,000s of people and so on. We actually talk about the numbers which could radically transform the ethnic composition in Kazakhstan, for example, right? The idea is, we said, this idea of homeland and this idea of both ownership or the being part of the nation, becomes an important aspect, and this also would be reflected in the constitution. The first constitution since independence of 1993 did not have a special idea or mention about homeland. They were talking about the idea of the inviolable Kazakh statehood, also talk about the self-determination of self-determination of Kazakh nation. And for ethnic Kazakhs abroad, the constitution allowed dual citizenship. This is the short period when Kazakhstan allowed dual citizenship, and it was allowed only for ethnic Kazakhs abroad. So if you would be living in Turkey, Germany, somewhere else, you had the possibility to get also Kazakh citizenship. Right? Dual citizenship is a very tricky instrument, and Kazakhstan avoided dual citizenship with any country regarding any ethnic groups, because obviously we know that dual citizenship brings in certain type of complications. For example, a person who receives dual citizenship and holds a citizenship somewhere might not leave the country and come, because they have citizenship, they come as at convenience and they leave at convenience. While, for example, for certain groups which have loyalty affiliation with another country, dual citizenship would also might mean exactly the same thing, that those minorities might not go to their homeland, they will stay here, and being part of the legally both countries involving, for example, in elections and other thing, having political impact, but that would not lead to repatriation. The Constitution of 1995, which is the current Constitution, obviously with extensive modification, brought in the idea of common historical. So there's reference to the idea of the history, and they talk about the Republic of Kazakhstan, the state, and to the common historical fate. They also refer to the idea of historical Kazakh territory. So this is an idea that this is the historical homeland. So if you ethnic Kazakh somewhere, that's the homeland. And they removed dual citizenship. And this is, I mentioned the very important classical case of having dual citizenship. It's an important tool, and you should apply to it depending on your goals. The law on citizenship brought in, when we think about, for example, bringing in thousands, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Kazakhs should be legitimized, because Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic country. There are lots of people, different ethnicities, groups live here, some for generations, some for a very long time, or maybe historically. So the idea of why these people are coming is an important aspect, and this is when the legitimation comes forward. Right? In diaspora studies, this is known as the victim diaspora or victimization. So these are the group of people who were historically mistreated, repressed, and as an outcome of that, these are the people who have the right to come back here. Victim diaspora is an important aspect of state formation. Whenever we talk about, for example, idea of the Israeli repatriation, German repatriation, and so on and so forth, we come across this idea. And this idea is also brought in the legal documents. This is the law on citizenship, and also law on migration would refer to that. And so any legal aspects which deal with repatriations would have this idea. Here we talk about, of course, people who forcefully left the territory due to mass repressions, forced collectivization, and other inhumane political actions, and their descendants. So it serves lots of important goals. One is that this is your homeland. You were forced to live there for a generation, so you should come to your homeland. And another one is, of course, the justification why these people were brought, why these people received, for example, certain privileges. Just for an example, the early stages, an ethnic Kazakh repatriate was exempt from the military service. So that made it convenient, because there are certain countries when there's no military service, or they were not eager to do, and just like migrating and the young sons taken to the military, especially during the time of adaptation and so on. This was not the case. There was also privileges related to taxation and, for example, education, housing to a certain extent. So this is one of the legitimization attempts. So these are the people who were forced, driven out of here, and they have the full right to come back here. While the constitution, the new constitution, would refer to that. This is the country built in historical homeland and historical Kazakh territory, which basically means that if you're an ethnic Kazakh, this is where you should be, or this is where you could come. Looking at statistics, and I said there have been lots of waves in different periods and different political, different policies. There have been this quota regime, people who were supported to come, many people came on their own. So this is the, for different periods, the statistical distribution of ethnic Kazakhs. So basically the outcome is that by last year, according to official statistics, there have been more than 1 million people who repatriated to Kazakhstan. Ethnic Kazakhs we're talking about. So ethnic Kazakhs born outside Kazakhstan at the time of independence who came back. 1 million people for a small country like Kazakhstan, especially with a much smaller population. Few years ago, this is the very extensive part. It also mentioned that the children of the repatriates are not in these statistics. So obviously you could guess that their number could be more. And here we only talk about people who officially registered for permanent residentship. So these are the people who came to Kazakhstan for permanent residentship. If you're an ethnic Kazakh and came here for a job, for study, if you're not sure, if you temporary here, you're not in the statistics, but obviously the number of people who came, ethnic Kazakhs who came, is much bigger than 1.7 million. There are people who they send their children to study in Kazakhstan and they are not officially registered as that. And over time, the idea of repatriate, which is was known as oralman, and this was in legal term, which used in legal documents and in the law on migration, law on citizenship, was the major term, and for almost 30 years was in use. Obviously, the person oralman, also the Kazakh word oralu, coming back. So this is an idea that you come back because you left here and come back, an idea of repatriation. Now, the legal term is different. Khandas is related to blood, so the fellow, compatriot, brethren coming from the same blood. So this became an idea, and the many people thought that the idea that somebody is coming here, newcomer, might be a little derogatory, discriminative, and so this is the term. We could also say that this is also probably the reflection of the changing demographic situation. Looking at the ethnic Kazakh repatriation, this is one of the major repatriation policies ever carried in the world, basically comparable to Israel and Germany, the other two nations which had massive ethnic Jewish and ethnic German repatriation attempts. And if you look throughout the region, we would never see anything comparable there. So if we talk about, for example, ethnic Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, around 1/10 of them are those who were born somewhere else and came through repatriation, not to mention their children. And when we look at the situation now, the important aspect here I should mention is that we were supposed to have census last year, and we would have the final updated statistics back then, but due to pandemic, it was postponed. For those of you who are not in Kazakhstan, you might not know that we now have, even in this month and the next month as well, we have the national census, which is carried online. It also carried offline, depending on your choice. And so soon we would have the new census with new statistics. And if you had passed the questionnaire, you would see that there's actually lots of information about languages and ethnicity and religion and background and birthplace and so on. So hopefully we'll soon have very much updated statistics, but this is what we have up to now. Looking at migration, for example, right? There are 3.7 people in Kazakhstan who were born abroad. And this is an extensive number as well. Of course, this involves not only ethnic Kazakhs, obviously, it also includes people who are here for job, work, and so on. But for a country with a relatively small population, almost 4 million foreign-born population is huge, right? There is the World Migration Report has the statistics for the top migration destinations and top places of origin of migration. And these are the statistics for 2019, so pre-pandemic period mainly, right? So we talk about major countries, populated country. Kazakhstan is number 16 country in the world for migration destination, which, as we said, with having countries with like billions of population, hundreds of thousands of population, this is a very, very impressive number. Kazakhstan is number 16, ahead of Thailand. So by the number of people who visit Kazakhstan or who migrated to Kazakhstan is in top 20, and Kazakhstan is also in top 20 for the origin of migration. So Kazakhstan is the place where lots of people left for other countries. And we talked about ethnic migrations of Germans, Russians, and so on, ahead of Palestine. And considering the scattered population of Palestine, known fact of the dispersion and diasporas, so Kazakhstan still remains one of the major country with an outcome on migration. Looking at ethnic composition, these are estimations for 2019. As we said, we would have further more correct statistics after census. Some believe that this data outmodes very, very fast, because sometimes we talk about an annual, for example, more than 200, 250,000 increase of ethnic Kazakhs. The statistics would grow up. So now the ethnic Kazakh population of Kazakhstan is estimated to be more than 70%, while the ethnic Russian population dropped below 20. And of course, the starting point was around 39% for both of them at the time of independence. And we also know the trend that the birth rate and migrations, the ethnic Kazakh population is growing, and ethnic Russian population is decreasing, birth rates and migrations as well. So that's what I would like to present today. It took a little longer than I thought. Thank you for your participation. If you have any questions, I'll be very, very happy